So a very warm welcome on this fairly cold evening to this event hosted by Melbourne Climate Futures. Just as the last people are coming back from the very delicious food over there, I hope that you're very as impressed as I am with it. My name's Ben Neville. I'm one of the Deputy Directors at Melbourne Climate Futures. I would like to begin, of course, with acknowledging that we are meeting on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, and extend my respects to any other Indigenous people who are here with us this evening. And at Melbourne Climate Futures, we do recognise the potential of Indigenous knowledge to contribute to climate change adaptation and mitigation. And there was recently a very interesting piece of research by researchers up at Charles Darwin University showing that integrating Indigenous knowledge by overlaying an Indigenous calendar on top of scientists' weather forecasts improved solar forecasting by up to 26%, which of course can have measurable improvements then in generating solar energy. So one example of the types of the ways that Indigenous knowledge can contribute to our understanding of climate change, our response to it. We also recognise, however, that Indigenous Australians are also disproportionately affected by climate extremes, such as heat, drought and intense rainfall, which of course will only worsen as the climate continues to change. And that's the reason that Melbourne Climate Futures has been formed. We are in a climate emergency and the university is committed to its role as a climate leader, walking the talk on climate action and engaging with policymakers to improve our national and global climate outlook. And that outlook does need improving. While there have been some very good policy initiatives by this federal government, and Chris Bowen is a very good climate change minister, there are also troubling decisions, most recently the extension of Woodside's North West Shelf gas project, described by many as a carbon bomb. This government does seem to have been captured by the gas lobby and the idea that gas is a transition fuel, while at the same time bidding to host next year's COP31. Now, universities play an important role in informing climate policy with evidence-based research and also in convening important conversations that can push our knowledge and understanding of both the problems and potential solutions forward. And so it's wonderful that we can therefore host this conversation with Zoe Daniel. Now, Zoe, most recently, we know her as the Teal Independent member for Goldstein, but before that, Zoe spent almost 3 decades on the front line of news and current events. This included being the ABC's Africa correspondent, then Southeast Asia correspondent, and finally the ABC's bureau chief in the US. She reported on the regime of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, the Sierra Leone civil war, the Darfur genocide and South Sudan, the Khmer Rouge tribunal in Cambodia, the 2010 Thai political protests, and interviewed Aung San Suu Kyi. And she wrote a book about her experience covering the 2016 presidential campaign of Donald Trump, titled Greetings from Trumpland: How an Unprecedented Presidency Changed Everything. So Danger is her middle name. And the shenanigans in Canberra with the likes of Barnaby Joyce are nothing compared to some of the very real war criminals she's covered overseas. In May 2022, Zoe Daniel became the first woman and first independent elected to the federal seat of Goldstein, named after the internationally renowned suffragette Vida Goldstein. As a Teal Independent, Zoe is one of a group of representatives whose platforms became synonymous with driving strong climate action. Her policies centred on delivering effective environmental, social and health policies to her electorate. She, of course, lost her seat to Tim Wilson in the most recent election, which might allow her to speak more freely about her thoughts on Australia's climate policy, although probably just mostly gives her more time. This evening, Zoe will be in conversation with fellow journalist Joe Chandler about the challenges and successes of her term as a federal politician, advocating for effective and transformative climate policies and communicating and translating complex issues to community and policymakers. And I will introduce Joe Chandler to you. Joe is an award-winning freelance journalist, author, editor and journalism educator. Her focus is on explanatory boots-on-the-ground reporting across a diverse range of topics: climate, science, environment, health, human rights, women's and children's issues, and aid and development. She's filed from Africa, Australia, Antarctica, Afghanistan, and Papua New Guinea. She's earned numerous distinctions, including the Australia Museum Eureka Prize for Science Journalism, Walkley and Quill Awards, and the UNSW Bragg Prize for Science Writing. Formerly a long-time staffer at The Age, her work has featured in Nature, The Guardian, The New York Times, The Atlantic, The Monthly, Griffith Review, and ABC Radio National, among others. She's also the author of a book on climate field science, Feeling the Heat. Jo is now a senior lecturer and academic specialist at the Centre for Advancing Journalism here at the University of Melbourne. Before I do hand it over to Jo, I'd like to invite you to submit questions on Slido using the QR code or link on the screen. So if you, Jo, now over to you for the conversation. Thank you very much.
Welcome, everybody, and thanks very much for the introduction. Our conversation tonight is going to be very much focused around climate. This is a Melbourne Climate Futures event, but obviously the work Zoe's been doing over the last 3 years covers so many broad issues around women. We've just been talking a bit about her experience sort of moving the needle on a whole range of issues. But for tonight's purposes, I'm going to be very kind of one track around climate, given the audience and the venue and the hosts we have this evening. So almost exactly 3 years ago today, Zoe, you were making your maiden speech to the Australian Parliament, where you recalled what an unappealing prospect it was to have a political career after nearly 30 years watching the game as a journalist, and how the first time you were approached to run, your response was an unequivocal no way. And then explaining to the Parliament why you did stand and why you were there. Climate was absolutely at the heart of it, and it was the first thing you discussed. And you talked about how, as a correspondent for the ABC, you had a front row seat watching climate impacts, the impacts of global heating occurring in real time. You highlighted a couple of particular turning points, and one was the 2013 superstorm Typhoon Haiyan after it swept across the Philippines. The other was a conversation or an interview you had with Australian firefighter and Climate Council member Greg Mullins when he was watching forest fires rage across California in 2019. So watching you again talk about those things, and you were quite emotional in the Parliament when you mentioned those two incidents. And I thought, what was it? I wondered, what was it that you saw or learned in those moments that persuaded you that it was the right time or the right thing to move from a profession of witness into the sphere of activism as a climate campaigner and a politician?
Thanks, Jo, and good evening, everyone. Thanks to everyone for coming. Look, I think it was a desire to have more impact than just being the observer. And I think that after 27 years of journalism, about 15 years of that as a foreign correspondent, intermittently sort of coming back into Australia in between, I felt that I'd run out of rope to have impact in that profession. And it's not to say that, with great respect to yourself and all of our colleagues as journalists, that they don't continue to have impact. But I guess I felt that I'd had a unique range of experiences as a correspondent that could be put to use in another way. It was time for me to take those skills and try and use them to change policy and to have a place in the national conversation, if you like. And I think that many of those experiences that I've had are quite rare, and they position me to have, a sort of first-person perspective on the impact of global heating, climate change on communities. I think the commonality between the three examples that you mentioned is the impact on people. The 2013 typhoon, a superstorm, Typhoon Haiyan, which hit the central Philippines just as I was about to leave Southeast Asia in late 2013 in November. I was one of the first, if not the first, journalists to arrive on the scene. We landed on a Philippines Air Force C-130, and we landed into absolute, total and complete devastation. The storm surge had swept over the peninsula of Tacloban City and in effect wiped out a city of 200,000 people. And we literally got off the plane with all of our TV gear to a collapsed airport, storm sludge everywhere, and people who were just sitting in shock, having lost everything, their families, their homes. There were cars in trees. There was barely a building left standing. It was just absolutely horrific. And of course, what followed was the attempt by these people to get out. So law and order broke down. There was looting, there was shooting in the streets, there were storm refugees at the airport who were being held back by various soldiers who'd flown in from different countries to support the effort. And that was, I had covered lots of bushfires in Australia and floods, but that was like a really huge moment for me where I thought, wow, this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen to communities. And, Tacloban City, this is in 2013, it's still not fully recovered. It will never fully recover. And of course, that kind of experience stays with you. And then when I met Mullins 6 years later, also in November, so just exactly 6 years later, on the fire ground in California, very late season bushfires, which had this like a firestorm crossed, north of San Francisco, wiped out thousands of houses. And he was standing on the fire ground, and we were having a conversation about the fact that the northern and southern hemisphere bushfires are crossing over each other, and that we can't augment each other. And he told me that he and other emergencies to get a meeting with the Morrison government for months and months to say this summer in Australia is going to be a disaster, and they wouldn't meet them. And I just thought it was absolutely unconscionable. Of course, we all know 2019, 2020, where fires cut a swathed coast, Malakuta was cut off, the military had to go in to evacuate people. So again, just another case study of what happens to communities. And, we're all aware this keeps happening drip, drip, drip like the frog in a pot all around the world. And so from the point of view of someone who had seen the aftermath of these kinds of events, who had spoken to the people who were affected, I thought, well, surely I can be someone who can get in there to try to move that conversation forward. So for all of my reluctance to get involved in politics, having covered politics across the world, and the last element of that being, the election of Trump Mark 1, me into doing it, basically. And kids can be very persuasive. I think, I often say that my son said, someone's got to do something for us, Mum. But he also said, imagine if you, in 20 years' time, everything's, shit, and you didn't do anything, how would you feel? So he basically guilted me into it.
Thanks for that, Archie. After the Albanese government's landslide second term win in May, political scientist and distinguished Professor Robin Eckersley, who may or may not be here, but and is a lead member of the network hosting this event, wrote an analysis arguing that, quote, with the mandate it has, this is Labor's best chance to go down in history as the party that finally exercised the political leadership that is needed to confront the civilizational challenge of climate change. Then a few weeks later, as Ben mentioned in the introduction, amongst the other continuing expansions and extensions of fossil fuel projects, Labor gives the green light to Woodside's Northwest Shelf for another 40 years. So I'm curious, from what you've observed close up, how should we understand this government's approach to climate policy? And do you see any prospect of bold climate action from the Albanese government this term or the next, which would appear to be on the cards?
look, I was talking to a friend this week about this very issue, and he described the Albanese government as pragmatically cautious. And I think that that's a sort of a reasonable framing, a political point of view. My frustration with them over the previous term was that they would do sort of just enough to doing something, but not so much that it really upset people. And so the problem with that is that they tend to go about 60 or maybe 65% on things that they really should be 95% on. I think that the danger with the numbers, there's two ways of looking at those numbers. One is to say, well, you've got a mandate. We know that people are really concerned about climate, and you can use mandate to make brave policy. Well, the opposition is now that Labor or the government can appear to be by actually doing not much, because the opposition didn't have a climate policy. It still doesn't, as far as I know. Nuclear, I suppose. So what else is there? So that we're sort of potentially in a position where having such big numbers might allow them to be even less ambitious, because they kind of won't have to prove anything. And they think, well, we can just do a little bit and that'll seem to be enough compared to what the others would have done. And we'll probably be here for 6 years. I think really that, people like me and other people who are in this room, but also people who are in positions of influence on this particular issue of climate and energy, we need to be saying, okay, let's just make sort of calculated assumption that Labor's going to be in for the next 2 terms. Where do we want to be sea level in 5 years? Because after that, everything's off the table for an election where there might be a change of government. So I'd be trying to set the goal, the 5-year goal, and then as people who work in academia, policy, commercial organisations who have an interest in this field, to say, what do we need to try to achieve in 5 years, and then how are we going to get there? And then try to work to convince the government that this is going to be politically palatable, because at the end of the day, that's all that matters.
You talk about pragmatism. I guess the evaluation with that approach is that, well, they got away with it last term, but I'm also wondering, as you talk about that, about okay, there's not an opposition that's throwing up much in the way of or any policy on climate. They've got these big numbers. They can do pretty much anything that they want. So what are the other external factors that might persuade them that that it is appropriate to be doing more? And I guess I'm thinking about, if there is a COP31, a Pacific COP, and I know for all the cynicism around the Australian government's performance, a lot of, Pacific leaders, green leaders, are very keen on the idea of this COP as a mechanism for putting more focus and more leverage on this government to be kind of, I don't know, potentially embarrassed into action. So, and they're also thinking about something like the, get that sorted out. Something like the, we're expecting the International Court of Justice decision tomorrow. There's some thinking that it might, I think sort of inclination that it might come down with a sort of a broader finding around what Vanuatu is looking for, around the sort of, the obligations states have toward not harming other states by polluting the atmosphere with emissions. So something like that, even though that might not have an immediate binding effect, again, is that the sort of leverage, the kind of where Australia might feel beholden, I guess, to the international community to be seen to be less of a laggard and to be stepping up? Is there leverage in that if there's not within our own parliament?
Yeah, I think the COP is a huge opportunity. It's also a huge risk, given the social license issues that exist around the rollout of renewable energy, particularly in regional Australia. If it's not well handled, I think the national conversation could go horribly wrong. And so, if I was working in Chris Bowen's office, I'd be thinking really carefully about that before someone sort of steals that narrative away. And we know that there are players in the frame who do that. And misinformation and disinformation is a real problem. But, on the positive side, I think that the COP is an opportunity to really reframe a positive conversation around the energy transition, particularly. And that's something that the government should be thinking really carefully about. I think that at the end of the day, though, there are always multiple influences on getting the government to actually change its position or sort of move forward. And the key one has to be community, upward pressure. And I think that, well, I know there are many people in this room who worked on both of my campaigns, and there are thousands of people across the country who have engaged with community politics in part because of their concerns about climate. So, and notwithstanding the massive majority that Labor's got, their primary vote is still really sliding, as is the Liberal vote, obviously. So that sense of people wanting to be listened to is really powerful. And people should feel, empowered by the ability to use their voices to tell the government what they want. And I think the other piece is the changing nature of the electorate. You saw Gen Z and Gen X, and the influence on this most recent election. By the next election, there'll be another 700,000 people in that cohort who largely want stronger climate policy, and for whom this is a really central issue. And I think, the final thing I'll say is that I think I fell into this as well, to be honest, but I think at the most recent election, there was a deliberate attempt, which was successful, by the coalition to frame the election around cost of living as if that was the only thing people can care about, only one thing. And so Labor put all its focus there. And then probably those of us who were running as independents also had less of a focus on climate as a big picture issue than we had at the previous election. And, I'm not convinced it would have made any difference to me getting elected, but I think that was a mistake. Because in Goldstein, the polling showed that climate was still in the top 3 concerns of constituents. So, people are capable of being concerned about cost of living and, the future of their kids and HECS debt and climate policy. And in fact, climate policy and cost of living, of course, are interrelated as well. So we all have a job to do to keep climate in the national conversation.
As you say, 2022, when you got elected, was the climate election. We still, I guess, had the smell of those Black Summer fires, lingering and kind of haunting us, and that was a big part of it. But it was remarkable, the kind of, the vanishing, I guess, of climate at the top of the agenda in this last campaign. And I guess one of the things I wonder about there, you've talked about, reflecting on its absence. Is that sort of demonstrating where that's coming from? Is that the denial sphere has kind of worked to exhaust us to the point that we're kind of sick of talking about it, even though it's getting worse and we're seeing it? Or is it some hardwired failure of the human psyche to be able to deal with this sort of slow burning existential threat as opposed to some bitey thing that's right at our throat now? And and I guess my thinking as a journalist too, or is it some failure by us in our storytelling, our traditions, the way that we think we ought to be telling this story? You know, how could we do it better to be able to keep it in focus and to keep audiences connecting? So I'm just wondering what you see of that vanishing.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the multi-million-dollar question, isn't it? But I do think that the bigness of it is really hard. I mean, it's not rocket science to say it's so hard. How do you fix this? And people find it draining. I think that sense of, oh, I can't do anything, no matter what I do as an individual, it won't make a difference, that kind of thing. I think the nature of the conversation about climate, so any thread on social media where anyone mentions climate, there'll be just a pile-on of climate deniers, so it makes it really hard to actually have a nuanced conversation about it. I've been reflecting on this a bit, in all my spare time over the last few weeks. That, how do we flip that switch to a positive conversation? There's all this talk about this book Abundance, Ezra Klein and his colleague. And, one thing that sort of jumped out at me was this line, we should be able to sell the renewable energy transition as a positive thing, like a cleaner environment, and, all of the economic benefit that will come with it. But we've allowed it to become a negative thing for a lot of people. And so we need to find a way of bringing the people who are going to be directly affected by that into the room, to actually, tell the story, but not only tell the story, to build the evidence for positive outcomes for those communities. And I think that's quite urgent. And I think that, getting back to the COP is an opportunity to try to reframe that narrative if it's done well. And I think that, for example, some of the conversations about renewable energy in regional areas where there is, justifiable concern about solar and wind farms and how they affect local environments. But, often when you bring communities into those conversations and, support the change through cheaper energy for business and households and, a cleaner environment, then people will come on board with it. It's a process. The thing is that we don't have a lot of time, so it has to be done really deftly. And I'm not convinced that we as a society have done it very effectively. But there's also very much this seesaw effect, which is being deliberately driven by vested interests who don't want it to happen, scaring people, spreading misinformation. And also making even those who do sort of get on board with the change, making them feel, well, it progresses and then it stops, and then it progresses and then it stops, and thwarting investment in the industries that are going to get us to where we need to go.
Yeah, that tone of voice. I keep thinking when you were talking then about a positive framing, like someone like Christiana Figueres, who has this kind of, relentlessly optimistic kind of push around what can be done, and the books that have come out, and I'm going to forget her name now, Ayana Elizabeth Brown, the book around, all we can save and what if we get it right, that deliberate, positive, upbeat framing and looking at what can be achieved. And speaking of that, I guess one of the things we really wanted to talk about here, and I better talk about it before the clock runs us out, is, you've been inside the system. You've seen how the sausage gets made in terms of doing deals and policy. I guess we're interested in two things there. One, I guess, about, what you saw on the other side of the curtain that surprised or shocked you about that process. But I'm also thinking positively, what you learned about how to move the needle, how to get things through, how to bring together, how to get true action. And you've reflected when we were talking earlier about some of the things that you did manage to do. So tell us about those learnings, I guess, and if there is something we need to understand about the kind of the backroom sausage machine, if that would be really interesting to hear about too.
Yeah, and look, this is cause for optimism, actually. You know, there were a long list of things that my team and I were able to achieve by working collaboratively with government, and by bringing in experts to underpin the changes that had to happen through evidence. I was looking at some polling that was in The Age this morning that suggested that the majority of people don't want the opposition to just say no to everything. They would prefer them to collaborate with the government. And I thought, oh, wouldn't that be lovely? Because, you know, the government rightly dubbed them the coalition during the last term. And the thing is, I think that could be ascribed to any party in opposition in Australia, where the kind of status quo is you get elected, we'll say no to everything that you suggest without even looking at it. We'll let you stuff it up. You'll be voted out. Then we'll get in, and then you'll say no to everything we suggest, and we'll stuff it up, and then you'll get back in. And that just thwarts any substantive forward movement on any policy area. The thing that the independents have brought, and I would love to think that to some degree oppositions could consider that they have a part to play, is to actually get into a room with government and say, right, you want to do this. It's, as my 16-year-old daughter would describe it, it's a bit mid. We can make it better by doing this. Here are the gaps in it. Here's the expert, you know, evidence to back up what I've said. And then to actually negotiate a position that leads to better policy outcomes for everyone. One reflection that departmental staff made by the end of the last parliamentary term was that they would come into meetings with the independents, with ministers, and then they would walk out saying, wow, these independents actually want to talk about policy, not politics. So we don't go into a room to have an argument. It's actually a case of, well, okay, you're trying to, you know, amend the Family Law Act, but you've really missed, you know, a reference to family violence in the Family Law Act. So we really need to put that in. Or with the Climate Change Act, I had a concern because I had covered the Trump administration. I had covered Trump pulling out of Paris first time. And I thought, well, some future government may backslide on this, and I really wanted to put in a minimum, not a maximum clause. So it took a lot of negotiation with Chris Bowen, but there is a clause in that act that says 43% is a floor, not a ceiling. And it seems quite obvious, but I just wanted it actually there so that it encourages ambition, not that we just have to meet that we have to at least meet that. And so that's the kind of thing that you can do when you actually go into a room with good faith to have, you know, real conversations about good policy. And, you know, I know that some people listening will say, oh, well, that's really naive because that's not politics. And, you know, it's always going to be one side wins, one side loses. But the problem with that is that it's really difficult to make any progress in any portfolio. Housing, climate, violence against women, you know, these are long-term things. Tax reform, can't do them in 3 years because 3-year terms are basically 18 months. So without some level of cooperation and bipartisanship or multi-partisanship, it's really hard to move things forward.
So you've talked there about you know, the power and the leverage that an independent member can take there when they're free of, I guess, the party machinery. But I guess, and you're very optimistic despite your own very narrow, nail-bitingly narrow defeat about the future of Teals and independence. But I guess the critique, the criticism, the concern is, you know, how does a movement, a disparate movement of people with diverse priorities, how do they really bring about and leverage change if they don't have, I guess, a sort of, what a party brings, that centralised mechanism to ensure that they work together and that they exercise their strength collaboratively. So I guess I'm thinking about the limitations of a climate movement as opposed to a climate party. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so I think 2022 was, I think there was a book called The Teal Revolution. But I sort of have, and I know some of the others too, have a question around whether it's a revolution or an evolution. I think, the advent of independence or the rise of independence is a reflection of community frustration with lack of outcomes from the major parties. What that will evolve into, I don't know. I mean, the donation law reform, if I could call it that, which is basically a stitch up to prevent independents from getting elected, will be really problematic for new independents to get into the parliament. And so, what does that mean for exactly what you're saying? Will that force some level of evolution in that, that sort of independent concept? I don't know. But also, so you described the group as a sort of a disparate group. I don't think the incumbent independents are a disparate group. I think certainly they have different views on things, and we voted differently during the last term, but we were very values aligned. And the pillars of climate, integrity, equality, everyone is very aligned on those pillars. So, sometimes on individual pieces of legislation, people will vote differently. But I think from sort of at a high level, that group understands that they're, even as individual independents, that there's power in numbers on those issues. And both inside and outside the chamber, I might add. Because, if you've got several people pushing for one thing in the public square, not only in the way that you vote, but in the way that you talk about these things in the media and elsewhere, then you start to nudge or push or drag the major parties to that position. And I've sort of described it previously as a bit of a process of de-risking. When you push, I mean, Allegra Spender's done a lot, an enormous amount of work on tax reform, pushing that out and trying to actually get government or the major parties to just even start thinking about that, something that they don't want to do because it's innately risky. And, so that's a way of making change.
For the next 3 years at least, and we'll circle back to what might happen after that, you're outside politics, or maybe 2 years. And obviously there's a lot going on to get traction and action on climate in the world outside politics, in frontline actions. The sheer numbers of people turning up to something like the Rising Tide events in Newcastle, in boardrooms, in shareholder groups, in the courts. Are these frontiers our sort of last best hope if policy and politics continue to fail? And can they bring about meaningful change, those different spheres?
Well, I think that it's got to be sort of all of them simultaneously, really. And the community action, the community independence movement is part of that as well. So, each of those things is sort of a ground up effort in its own way. Legal action, I'm curious to see where that leads us, because, we haven't seen governments being particularly responsive to legal action previously. But again, I think public pressure is really critically important. And trying to sort of break the fatigue around this to inspire people to actually be involved and exert that pressure in whichever sphere that you've mentioned is the key.
I've got a couple of questions, I guess, around journalism. Having crossed over from journalist to politician, what was your observation of journalists and journalism from the other side? If you could reflect a bit on, I guess, the practice as you experienced it, and whether you think it's changed or is changing for the worst, or has it been ever thus, and it's just that you've now got a different viewpoint on it?
Yeah, has it changed? Has it got worse, or have I just become an old, crusty former journalist that is critical of journalists? It's a really good question. So the first point I'd make is that, and I was like this as well, as a reporter, you think you know what's going on. And, you know, there's a sort of a level of arrogance in that. But having been on the other side of it now and then looking at media coverage of things that I was involved in, I'm like, well, that's about 20% of what was going on. So 80% of it is under the surface. And also, this makes perfect sense, of course, and this is what reporters do, is they get sort of snippets of information and then they tie them all together and make them into a story. And sometimes those zigzags don't really connect. So when I read media coverage now, sometimes I laugh because I think that's actually not what's going on at all. You know, there's still some really good reporters out there. But I think that unfortunately the business model is so broken that we have a lot of really young, keen junior journos who come in, and sort of a smaller group of very senior people who are totally avalanched with work, and probably not enough middle. And then, so the younger journalists don't get the sort of mentoring and training that they need, and the older journalists are just so overwhelmed because they have to cover every big story that you lose depth. And I think that's a huge problem. It's a huge problem for society. And, you know, whether it's a quality issue that's causing people to switch off from mainstream media, but, you know, we also have this issue where people are just not consuming mainstream media or social media, actually. Like a lot of people, one of the big issues for MPs and candidates is how do you actually reach people? Because a lot of people aren't really consuming anything because information is so negative. It's scary, unpleasant. Who wants to know? Better to stay in your bubble. So, you know, I think I'm a big believer in the public broadcasters, obviously, but I think there's rebuilding to be done there. But I think there's also, you know, a strong case for government support for, you know, new media organisations, regional media organisations, suburban media organisations to, you know, to help tie communities back together, because, you know, there's all sorts of other spin-offs around social isolation and such that come from that lack of connection.
We're going to go to questions from the audience in just a moment. So hopefully some of you have used the Slido to submit something. But the burning question, you know, will you do it all again? Will you stand again?
Look, of course, everyone keeps asking me, and my answer is, you know, probably, maybe, maybe, probably. You know, it's a short time, but it's a substantial amount of time. I've only just come out of what was a pretty, to put it mildly, brutal campaign. The dynamics have really changed in terms of the numbers, and I'm really interested to see what kind of impact the independents can have over the term. And, you know, it may depend on what I end up doing with myself, because, you know, I can make a strategic decision about whether I can have more impact, whether it's better to be on the inside or the outside. Certainly, there is absolute appetite for me to run again in the community, and there's enormous support for an independent voice in Goldstein. And, you know, I think, like, I wear that proudly, and so should everyone who worked with me. It's one of the most difficult seats in the country to tackle, and the fact that we won it the first time and then almost won it the second time is pretty extraordinary, actually. And so it's a process, Joe. That's just the most honest answer I can give. I'm not firm either way at this point. But, you know, I'm literally a month out of packing up 2 offices and putting off all my staff. So, and having to, you know, there is a level of frustration around a lot of work in progress that just stopped overnight. And, you know, it would be a shame not to be able to continue some of that.
Well, it's an absolute credit to your strength and that you're even considering it after, as you say, after this really brutal campaign, often toxic campaign that you endured. And so the fact that you're putting your hand up again is pretty remarkable. You've said before that, I guess, growing up in Tassie and with the family background, you know, that idea that, you know, whatever gets you is going to, adversity makes you stronger, seems to be your watch phrase, I guess. And
well, I think that, and, you know, said when I conceded the seat, and because I know that I have a lot of young people who supported me, and I've spent an enormous amount of time in schools over the last 3 years and really trying to, you know, just provide an example of female leadership to kids and young people. And at the end of the day, I mean, it's a hard lesson, but you're always going to learn a lot more out of failure than success. It's hard. It's not easy. But, you know, it's interesting, even just this close out from the election, I think that if I was elected again, I'd be a much better MP than I was, because I've already learnt so much in the last few months and sort of reflected differently than I would have if I just walked straight back into the seat.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, like anything, you need to take that as a productive exercise, even though obviously it wasn't the outcome that I was looking for. And then you know, I have been, when I say I've been lucky in my life, people often say, well, it's not just luck, you've engineered it for yourself. But, you know, I've had amazing opportunities over my life as, you know, 3-time foreign correspondent. I've lived all over the world, ran my own consultancy company, I've written a few books, became an MP. I mean, you know, who knows what will happen next?
Kids in your spare time.
Couple of kids, yeah.
Let me go to some of these questions. And okay, we've got one of them. With what you know today, what are you most hopeful for in terms of realistic and practical change that can help improve our collective situation around climate? So I guess that's the hope question, really.
Yeah, I think it's just sort of made me think of a Q&A that I went to with a group of high school students. I think they were year 11s, and it's a bit random because they wrote a letter to Jim Chalmers and asked him if he would come and speak to them. And so I got a call from the Treasurer's office, you know, on a Thursday night to say, oh, Jim's going to be at Furbank Grammar, I think it was, tomorrow. Do you want to come? I was, sure. And I thought it was really bizarre because it's like, it's not a Labor seat and he's a Queenslander, and anyway, whatever. And the thing is, young people ask such pointed questions that older people won't ask. And one of the girls said, what failure do you think would follow you as a minister? And it's like, whoa. And I mean, I hope Jim doesn't mind me sort of paraphrasing this, but he said something like, I think if we fail on the climate and energy transition, people will really judge us for that. And I think that's true. And the energy transition is an enormous piece of work. But I also took heart from it. that when he was asked that question, that was the first thing that came to mind for him. And I think that says something about where the government's head is at on this. And I think that, you know, we all need to be involved in keeping our hands on their backs to make sure that they don't backslide to get us where we need to be. But I think that also from a commercial point of view, we will get to a point where the transition is so far advanced that turning it backwards will be more difficult than taking it forward. And so we just have to persist.
We've got a lot of questions here, so I'll try and shoot through a few more. The last election suggested that the Murdoch press doesn't have maybe the influence it once did over the electorate. Do we not need to worry about climate denialism anymore?
Well, having spent a lot of time on the front pages of the Murdoch papers, I was quite happy that they didn't seem to have as much influence in the 2025 election as they did in 2022 in some ways. But the thing is, I think that it's a reflection of people not consuming mainstream media rather than a reflection of climate denialism not working. So I think it's just happening in other spaces. And, you know, it is something to be alive to, and it's something for people like you and I to be really alive to as people who are communicators about how we communicate the positive story better, how we become the louder voice on just about everything that you can think of, like something like gambling advertising. If I was to post something on my social media about gambling advertising, which we know 75% of Australians want gambling ads banned, I would be shouted down by all the people saying, oh, you're woke, don't tell me what to do, blah, blah, blah. And we know those people represent a tiny proportion of the community, yet they're the most visible people on my threads. And we just need to be really aware of that.
What reforms do you wish to see in the parliamentary lawmaking process to ensure good, effective policy that addresses our pressing issues, climate or other?
Look, I think there's lots of changes that could be made to parliamentary procedure that would make it more democratic and more effective. So there were lots of conversations between the crossbenchers during the last parliament, and hopefully they'll continue them, about things like the government will never go for this, but reducing Dorothy Dix's during question time was one. You know, sort of changing the makeup of the way things are done in the chamber so that it serves the people better rather than the party that's in power. So that's one thing. You know, I'll be interested to see what happens at the government's productivity summit, because obviously a focus of that will be things like reducing regulation in order to, you know, that's another thing about that book Abundance, that it talks about the sort of counterproductivity of regulation to protect the environment that is now counterintuitively harming the environment because we can't get renewable energy projects up, that kind of tension. So, you know, they're the kinds of areas, I think. And, you know, the media, strength of the media is important to that question too. Because if no one's asking the questions, then none of us are getting the answers.
Okay, what are the biggest pieces of mis or disinformation about climate change that you heard from politicians and lobbyists behind the scenes while you were in Parliament? I suspect that might be quite a long list.
No, look, I won't go through a list because it's probably all the sort of obvious things, but I will say that it can be quite weird no one watches Parliament outside of question time, of course, but as an MP, you're often in the chamber when other people are giving speeches, and sometimes you're just listening to the speech going, wow. You know, the kinds of things that come out of some elected representatives' mouths, which are just not fact-based, are really not appropriate. And I think, I mean, during question time on a couple of occasions, I called out the opposition for framing misinformation into questions or disinformation into questions. Because, of course, if you say something often enough, it becomes true. That's a very Trumpian sort of approach. And so, you know, I think we all have a responsibility, particularly in the public arena as obviously I'm no longer an MP, but people who are elected representatives should be making sure that what they say is factual. It shouldn't be complicated.
No. How can we understand Labor's capture by the gas lobby?
Well, a lot of history, a lot of money, and also I think arguably the seesawing approach to the rollout of renewable energy has created a situation where we now have, you know, ailing coal-fired power plants, which then creates an argument for another firming fuel, which is gas, and then we end up with gas out to 2070, which obviously I have a view that we should be transitioning off gas as quickly as possible, and that we certainly shouldn't be embedding it into the system until 2070. Even if we do need it, you know, there's lots of arguments and counter arguments about transition fuels. But if we do need it as a transition fuel, we should be getting off it as quickly as possible.
So I'm just scanning these questions because there's so many and we've probably got only one left. Just trying to make sure we're going into fresh territory. What can be done to better engage with voters who have become disillusioned with politics and the major parties so that their voices can be heard? I guess that goes to the independents, but
So I'll try and answer it in a sort of apolitical way, but by framing it through the lens of what the independents have done. The genesis of the community independence movement in many ways was kitchen table conversations that were run by the Victorian Women's Trust. And the idea was to get people into a room around a table, people of different political positions, to have a conversation about what they wanted out of their politics. And then, you know, the eventual sort of result of those kitchen table conversations was community independence. But I know that since the 2022 election, obviously the major parties have adopted a lot of the tactics and practices that community independents use to try to reach people. So, you know, having more grassroots conversations in communities. And I think that it's a productive exercise for not only independents, but anyone who is in politics from any side of politics to actually get in small groups with people and listen. The lost art of listening is really important. And I think that's one thing that in many ways it's sort of one of the key things that propelled me into politics was covering the election of Trump the first time. And I spent a year in 2016 talking to Trump supporters and they all felt unheard. And then that made them so angry. And then look where we are now. So we actually need to listen better. And then it's not going to be perfect, but try to translate that listening into understanding of what people need to make life better.
that actually sounds like a perfect note on which to end our conversation. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry for the questions that I didn't get to. There were a few left there, but you've been really generous with your time and with your thoughts, and really grateful to you to come and have a chat to us, all of us here tonight, about what you've seen and observed, and hopefully we'll hear from you soon about what you're going to do next.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, everyone.